Welcome back to another segment of Behind the Scenes of the Waltons. Today is a special edition because I wanted to wish a very happy birthday to David Harper. This is his 64th birthday. He was born October 4th, 1961. During the 4+ years that I have been doing this YouTube channel, I have spoken about David a number of times, both overall and also in relation to specific episodes. And most recently, he joined me because he wanted to pay tribute to Lynn Hamilton, who played Verdi Grant. So a lot of the things that I have said about David, I may repeat just because the things that stand out to me about David just are what they are. And so I've shared them a few times. If you haven't seen the various different segments I've done with David, you can search them in my channel and see. He's always great to have as a guest because he's just so real. He just kind of says what he thinks, and he doesn't worry too much about being Hollywood. He's certainly not Hollywood. He's a regular guy living a simple life, and he's just a sweet, kind, sensitive soul, a deep thinker. He loves reading, particularly history. He's fascinated by the Civil War and other points in history. And he said he usually has several books going at the same time, and that's one of his true passions. So I hope that you've had a chance. And if not, do try and check out some of those segments with David, and you'll get a real sense of him just as a person. David was born in Abilene, Texas, and he was pretty young when they moved to California. So he was already living there when he was cast as Jim Bob Walton in The Homecoming. And mostly what I remember about him in The Homecoming was this shaggy mop of hair that was always hanging in his eyes, and we could barely see his eyes. But what was very special to me there was that relationship they established between Jim Bob and Elizabeth, and how as the youngest boy and the youngest girl, they really sort of bonded, and how sort of protective Jim Bob was as that little bit older brother to Elizabeth, and yet still able to relate to her because he was still so much a child himself. So the sweet scenes they had in the hayloft after everyone did laugh at her about saying that she wasn't going to have babies, she was going to have puppies, and him trying to explain why she couldn't have puppies. And then the whole thing about she was never going to grow up, and they relate some story about Daddy and this yellow duck, and how to keep it from growing, they just squeezed all the time. And so they were going to, anytime they felt like they were growing, they were going to squeeze and push it back in. So they didn't grow up. So just the wonderful innocence of youth that we saw from the two of them in The Homecoming. I made note of just some of my top favorite episodes that featured Jim Bob, and I'm sure you all will have your own favorites. And I frequently have people, when I touch on things, say, but you didn't mention this episode or that episode. I mean, obviously there were so many episodes, and David always did such wonderful work that I'm not going to touch on all of them. So if I miss your favorite, I'm sorry, and you can certainly share what your favorites were in the comments below. So at the beginning, he wasn't featured in a whole storyline of his own very often in the first few seasons, and I'm sure that was because he was one of the younger ones. But one of the first episodes was in season 1, episode 3, The Calf, when he and Elizabeth don't want that calf to be sold. And so they decide that they're going to take it someplace and hide the calf, and they'll just go out and feed it, and that way Daddy won't be able to sell it. And so they take the calf and they go off, and of course they get lost in the woods, and then the family has to go out and find them. So that was a very sweet episode from season 1. And then in season 3, episode 4, The Runaway, when Jim Bob's having a really tough time. He has brought home the guinea pig Porthos, and it has died in his care, and he keeps trying to talk to different people about what's going on and how upset he is about it, and nobody seems to have time for him. And so he decides, nobody cares, and so he's going to leave. And so he kind of runs away, And of course, John Boy goes and searches for him and finds him, and they have a bit of an adventure together and get to share a special little treat at a little coffee shop, and it's again just a fun episode and sad and poignant, but ultimately very sweet. As we moved on in the seasons, some of the storylines for Jim Bob became a little bigger. In season 4, the wing walker, he falls for Bobby Strom, the wing walker, and of course his fascination with airplanes and everything. And so he has one of his first heartbreaks when Bobby very gently sort of, lets him down. And so that was kind of a pivotal one for Jim Bob. In season 4, episode 15, The Search, when Olivia and Jim Bob and Elizabeth get lost in the woods, when Elizabeth has chased off the chicken, she's trying to find the chicken, and they all end up lost, and Jim Bob is able to utilize all of the things that he learned from Grandpa about nature. And so he really sort of saves the day and keeps them safe, and is a bit of a protector of Mama and Elizabeth in that episode. And then the very next episode was The Secret, episode 16, which is so heartbreaking when Jim Bob, he thinks he's maybe been adopted, and because he can't find pictures, and Elizabeth's really being kind of nasty to him and making fun of him, saying, yeah, he probably was adopted. And ultimately he and John Boy go to look at the county records, and they discover that Jim Bob had a twin who died at birth. And so ultimately he finds out that is why it wasn't talked about, particularly because it was just so painful for Mama and Daddy was looking to protect Mama. So a beautiful sort of reconciliation at the end when John finally does talk with Jim Bob, and then Jim Bob comes in and sees Mama, and no words are spoken, but she knows, he knows, and they just share this beautiful hug. So a wonderful episode and some beautiful moments for Jim Bob there. In season 5, one of the standouts for me was the great motorcycle race, when Jim Bob's mechanical aptitude is showcased because he takes Ike's motorcycle and he tinkers with it, and then he's going to enter it in a motorcycle race. And he's also looking to impress a girl. He's getting a little older, and he's starting to eye the girls. And Patsy Brimmer, he's having a little flirtation with. And David has said on my channel and other places that Elaine McDonough, who played Patsy Brimmer in those episodes, she was Debbie Gunn, who usually played Patsy, was not available, so they cast Eileen McDonough for an episode or two. And no relation to Mary McDonough, but he was quite smitten with her in real life, and he was always a little kind of shy, and I think that he would have liked to have pursued that relationship, but was just a little shy at that point in his life. Then in season 6, we had episode 10, The Flight, where he meets a boy who's heading off, he says, down to Florida, where he's going to join up and fly airplanes. And so he's a real kindred spirit with Jim Bob. And ultimately, we find out that Joe's actually running away. He and his sister were in foster care, and he's trying to protect his sister. And they end up getting adopted, I believe, by Epp and Sarah Bridges. So they're going to be around, although we don't see him again, but he was like a real buddy for Jim Bob. And also in season 6 was The Ordeal, when Elizabeth falls off the log pile that Jim Bob hasn't secured and ends up getting her legs crushed under that. And he just feels tremendous guilt and responsible for that, and has a really hard time. But ultimately, he's the one that sort of helps Elizabeth to trust and walk again. As we moved into season 7, Jim Bob had a few storylines. The Calling, episode 2, he had another broken heart when Mary Frances decides that she's going to pursue her calling to become a nun, and so that budding romance is over. Season 7, episode 10, Dave Infamy, was my standout scene, my favorite scene that I got to do with David, Mary Ellen, and Jim Bob scene when Jim Bob is the one who brings the telegram and lets Mary Ellen know that unfortunately Kurt has been killed at Pearl Harbor. So a heartbreaking scene, and one that I was so touched to be able to share with David. Episode 16, The Burden. Jim Bob's been irresponsible, horsing around, goofing off, not really paying attention to things he's doing. And he is nearly killed when the car he's working on collapses on him. And so it's a real wake-up call for him. So another really strong episode for David. And then episode 22, The Tailspin, when Jim Bob finds out that his eyesight is not good enough to be able to fly. And that dream that he has had forever, it seems, is now out of his reach, and he doesn't know what to do with that. So a tough emotional episode for Jim Bob as he has to come to terms with finding a new purpose and a new path forward for himself. In season 8, episode 11, The Silver Wings, Jim Bob meets the young woman, Betsy Randolph, whose husband is off in the, I believe he's in the Air Force flying. And Jim Bob forms kind of a crush on Betsy, even though she's a married woman. But he still has a bit of a crush there. But then she finds out that her husband's been killed, and he now has to step up and not have this crush as much as be there as a friend for her and be someone that she can count on. So really sort of a more mature step forward for Jim Bob there. And then in episode 24, the final episode of season 8, The Valediction, when Jim Bob, after all those times of all his goofing off over the last few years and not getting good grades and stuff, he's the high grade point in his class, and he's the valedictorian. So this is a big step forward for Jim Bob, and a good featured episode storyline for David. A couple of standouts for me in season 9 were episode 6, The Pursuit, when a girl claims that Jim Bob is the father of her unborn child. So he had to do some very mature work there in that episode. And then finally, episode 12, The Hot Rod, when he and Jody decide that they are going to open a garage together. And so this is the beginning of Jim Bob's journey forward as post-war and what direction he's going to go with his life. Of course, that segued into the various different reunion movies we did where Jim Bob was working as a mechanic, and also then he was working as an airplane mechanic, and so he continued that path. Unfortunately, we never got to see Jim Bob really find his mate for life, the love of his life. And by the end of the reunion movies, Jim Bob was one of the only ones who had not been married. Elizabeth was on the cusp, having become engaged to Drew, but Jim Bob was the one that we like to hope that beyond the point where we did reunion movies, that we can imagine that Jim Bob found the woman who was right for him and was able to get married and have a family of his own. So that is my wish for Jim Bob's future that we didn't get to see. In real life, David himself has never married or had children, but who knows? And of course, after the Waltons, David did continue and do a handful of other TV and film roles, including the miniseries The Blue and the Gray and the movie Fletch with Chevy Chase. So thank you for joining me to wish David a very happy birthday, and hopefully those of you who have not had a chance to meet him and those of you who have might have the opportunity to see him again at a future Waltons reunion. So thank you for joining me. I will see you next time for more behind the scenes of the Waltons, more Ask Judy, and I have some more special guests coming up, including Lisa Harrison, who played Tony Hazelton. So if you have a question that you might like me to ask Lisa, please put it in the comments because I'm going to be speaking with her very soon. Thanks for watching.